They called her a witch. They beat her husband in the street until he couldn't stand. Then they gave her a choice: leave town forever or burn alive. She chose to run. Her husband died 4 days later in a frozen barn, his last breath fading in her arms as the winter tried to bury them both. For 32 days, she lay dying in that barn, starving, freezing, waiting for death to finally take her. Then a stranger kicked open the door, and everything changed. But here's what her accusers didn't know. She wasn't the monster. She was the only one who knew the truth about why their children were really dying. And when she came back to face the mob that destroyed her life, she didn't come for revenge. She came with proof that would burn their lies to the ground. This is Valora's story, a woman they left for dead who rose to save the very people who tried to kill her. This story proves that fear burns bright but burns out quickly, while courage flows like water, finding a way around every obstacle. The truth doesn't need a mob. It only needs one person brave enough to speak it. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if you've ever been the target of whispers and lies, this story is your vindication. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to prove the truth when everyone believed the lie? Subscribe now and stay until the very end. Valora's revenge is unlike anything you've seen. The winter wind tore across the empty fields like a living thing hunting for prey. It found every crack in the abandoned barn. It slipped through broken boards and rotten wood. It searched for anything still warm enough to steal heat from. Inside that barn, curled in a pile of frozen hay, a woman lay dying. Valora Finch had stopped counting the hours 2 days ago. Time meant nothing when hunger consumed every thought. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold them together for warmth. Her stomach had moved past pain into a hollow emptiness that felt like her body eating itself from the inside. She was 34 years old. She had survived childhood fever. She had survived the death of her parents. She had survived losing 3 babies before they could take their first breath. But she was not sure she would survive this. The snow continued falling outside. It piled against the barn walls like nature itself was trying to bury her alive. Valora pulled her torn coat tighter around her thin frame, though the fabric did nothing anymore. The cold had already settled deep into her bones. It lived there now, a permanent guest that would not leave until it killed her. Once, Valora Finch had been strong. Once, people traveled from miles away to seek her help. She knew which plants could break a fever. She understood how to set a broken bone so it would heal straight. She could bring babies into the world when other women failed. Mothers trusted her with their children. Farmers trusted her with their livestock. The whole town of Belwick had trusted her, until they did not. Valora dragged herself across the frozen ground to the small window. Her arms felt like they belonged to someone else. Every movement cost energy she could not afford to spend. But she needed to see. She needed to know if they were coming. She wiped the frost from the glass with her sleeve and peered outside. The farmhouse nearby stood dark and silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light flickered in the windows. The family who lived there had abandoned it weeks ago, fleeing the sickness that had swept through Belwick like wildfire. Before they left, they had locked every door and boarded every window. They had taken every scrap of food with them. Valora remembered that farmhouse when it was full of life. She remembered delivering the youngest child there, a healthy baby boy with lungs strong enough to wake the whole county. She remembered the mother crying with joy, pressing coins into Valora's hands, calling her a blessing from heaven. That same mother had stood in the crowd 3 weeks ago. She had watched with cold eyes as the town pastor pointed at Valora and called her a servant of the devil. She had said nothing when the men dragged Valora's husband Samuel into the street and beat him with their fists. She had done nothing. None of them had done anything except watch. Valora sank back down into the hay, too weak to stand any longer. Her mind drifted to that terrible night, though she tried to push the memories away. They came anyway, sharp and clear as broken glass. The sickness had arrived in Belwick in early autumn. It started with the livestock. Cows stopped giving milk, horses grew weak and stumbled, chickens died in their coops overnight. The farmers whispered about bad luck and cursed soil, but no one thought much of it at first. Then the children started getting sick. It began with fever. Then came the shaking, then the vomiting, then something worse. Something that turned their skin gray and made them cry out in pain that no medicine could touch. 3 children died in a single week. 3 small bodies laid in the cold ground while their parents wept. The town needed someone to blame. Valora had tried to help them. She had mixed every remedy she knew. She had stayed up through the night with sick children, pressing cool cloths to their burning foreheads. She had prayed until her knees ached and her voice went raw. But the children still died, and the whispers started. The healer could not save them. The healer failed. Maybe the healer did not want to save them. Maybe the healer caused the sickness in the first place. Pastor Whitmore fed those whispers like a man throwing wood on a fire. He had never liked Valora. He did not approve of women who knew more than their husbands. He did not trust anyone who healed without reading from Scripture first. When the 3rd child died, Pastor Whitmore called a town meeting. Valora still remembered standing in the church, surrounded by faces she had known her whole life. Faces that had smiled at her for years. Faces that now looked at her with fear and hate. The pastor walked up to her slowly. He reached out and pulled down the collar of her dress, exposing the red birthmark on her collarbone. A mark she had carried since birth. A mark her own mother had called a kiss from the angels. "This is the devil's sign," Pastor Whitmore declared. His voice echoed through the silent church. "This woman has been marked by Satan himself. She has brought this curse upon our town." Valora had tried to speak. She had tried to explain that birthmarks meant nothing. That sickness came from bad water or spoiled food or simple misfortune. That she had done nothing wrong. No one listened. Her husband Samuel stepped forward to defend her. Samuel, with his gentle eyes and his kind heart. Samuel, who had never raised his voice to anyone in his life. He tried to reason with them. He tried to remind them of all the good Valora had done. They beat him until he could not stand. Then they gave Valora a choice. Leave Belwick forever or burn. She chose to leave. She chose to take her broken husband and flee into the winter night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. She chose to run rather than die in flames while her neighbors watched and called it justice. Samuel lasted 4 days. The cold was too much for him. The injuries from the beating had weakened him beyond recovery. He died in this very barn, his breath fading as Valora held his hand and begged him to stay. She buried him in the frozen ground outside. It took her 2 days to dig a grave deep enough. Her hands bled from the effort. She carved his name into a wooden cross with a piece of broken glass. Samuel Finch, beloved husband, died a good man in a cruel world. Every day since then, Valora had scratched another mark into the barn wall. 32 marks stared back at her now. 32 days since the only person who ever truly loved her took his last breath. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small silver pendant. It was the only thing she had managed to hide when the mob came. Her grandmother had given it to her on her wedding day, pressing it into her palm with tears in her eyes. "Keep this close," her grandmother had whispered. "It belonged to my mother, and her mother before her. It will protect you when nothing else can." The pendant had not protected her from the mob. It had not protected Samuel from death. But Valora clutched it anyway because it was all she had left. If she could reach the next town, she might be able to trade it for food. But the next town was 15 miles away. In her current state, she would collapse before she made it halfway. The wind howled outside like a wounded animal. Her stomach answered with its own cry of pain. For the first time since Samuel died, tears burned in her eyes and spilled down her hollow cheeks. Maybe death would be kinder than this slow waiting. Maybe she should just close her eyes and let the cold take her. Maybe she would see Samuel again on the other side. She was about to surrender to that thought when the barn door slammed open. Cold air rushed in like a wave. Snow swirled through the opening along with darkness and the smell of pine. Valora scrambled backward on instinct, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. A massive shadow filled the doorway. Not the mob she had feared. Not Pastor Whitmore coming to finish what he started. Something else entirely. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying an axe over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. His face was hidden in shadow, but his voice cut through the wind like a blade through silk. "Who is there?" he demanded. "This is private land." Valora pressed herself against the wall, barely able to speak. The words came out as a whisper, rough and broken. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." The stranger stepped inside and shut the door against the storm. As the darkness settled, Valora's eyes slowly adjusted. She saw him clearly now. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face. His heavy coat was dusted with snow. His arms were built from years of swinging that axe through wood. But his eyes were what caught her attention. Dark and sharp, they scanned the barn like a hunter reading tracks. When they settled on her frail shape, something in them changed. He set the axe down against the wall. He reached into his coat. Valora flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small cloth bundle. When he opened it, the smell hit her like a beautiful dream. Bread, warm bread, and a chunk of yellow cheese. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Valora could not remember. 3 days, maybe 4. She shook her head. "It does not matter," she said weakly. The stranger crouched down and held the food toward her. "It matters to me," he said. "Eat." Valora's hands trembled as she reached for the bread. Every instinct told her to be careful. Every lesson life had taught her warned against trusting strangers. But hunger screamed louder than fear. She tore a piece of bread and forced herself to chew slowly. Her stomach cramped at the first bite, protesting after so many days of emptiness. She almost cried from the pain and the pleasure mixed together. The stranger watched her without speaking. He stayed crouched near the door, giving her space. His eyes never left her face, but there was no threat in them. Only something that looked almost like understanding. "Why are you helping me?" Valora asked between bites. The stranger shrugged his massive shoulders. "I am not looking for payment. That is not an answer." He was silent for a long moment. The wind continued screaming outside, rattling the barn walls. Finally he spoke again, his voice lower now. "My mother was burned as a witch when I was 10 years old. She grew plants, healing plants. The town did not understand." Valora stopped chewing. She stared at the stranger with new eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "It was not your doing." Then his gaze dropped to her hollow cheeks, her shaking hands, her torn clothing. "Just like what happened to you was not your doing." Something cracked inside Valora's chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the night Samuel died. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen. Not as a witch, not as a monster, just as a woman who had been wronged. The stranger stood up and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "My cabin is 3 miles north of here," he said. "There is a fire, more food. You can come if you can walk." "Why would you take that risk?" Valora asked. "You do not know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know what fear does to small-minded people. I know what happens when they find someone to blame." He walked to the barn door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in again, but this time Valora did not flinch from it. "My name is Thorley Blackwood," the stranger said, turning to look at her over his shoulder. "Can you walk, Valora Finch? Or will I carry you?" She blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" Thorley nodded toward the corner of the barn, toward the wooden cross she had carved and placed against the wall beside the marks she scratched each day. "Your husband's grave is outside," he said quietly. "I have walked past it many times. I read the name. Figured his wife would not be far." Valora felt fresh tears threaten to spill. She pushed them down and forced her body to move. Her legs screamed in protest as she stood. The world tilted dangerously, but she grabbed the wall and stayed upright. "I can walk," she said. Thorley watched her take 3 shaking steps toward him. Then he sighed and crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. "Your pride is going to kill you," he said. Before she could protest, he bent down and lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. "Put me down," Valora demanded weakly. "When we get to the cabin," Thorley replied. He carried her through the barn door and into the howling storm. The journey felt like a dream. Valora drifted in and out of awareness, her head resting against Thorley's chest. She could hear his heartbeat through his thick coat, steady and strong. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. She did not know how long they traveled. She only knew that at some point, the wind stopped biting her face. Warmth began creeping back into her bones, and when she opened her eyes, she was somewhere new. The cabin was small but solid. Rough wooden walls surrounded her on all sides. A fire burned bright in a stone hearth, its light dancing across every surface. The smell of pine smoke and something cooking filled the air. Thorley set her down in a chair beside the fire. The heat washed over her like a wave, sinking deep into her skin. She had forgotten what warmth felt like. "Stay there," Thorley said. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, pouring something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. When he placed it in front of her, steam rose from the surface. "Broth," he explained. "Go slow. Your stomach will not forgive you if you rush." Valora took the bowl with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. She sipped carefully, and the liquid spread through her body like liquid gold. While she ate, she studied the cabin. It was a lonely place. One bed pushed against the far wall, one chair at a small writing desk, one cup hanging from a hook near a water bucket. Everything built for one person living alone. "You have no wife?" she asked. "No family?" Thorley sat down across from her, the firelight turning his dark beard a warm copper color. "No," he said simply. The word hung in the air between them. Valora sensed a story behind it, but she did not push. She had her own stories she did not want to tell. When she finished the broth, she set the bowl down and met his eyes. "They will come looking for me," she said. "The people from Belwick. They followed me once already, trying to finish what they started." Thorley nodded slowly. "I know. If they find me here, they will hurt you too. They will call you my accomplice. They will say you are helping a witch escape justice." "Let them come," Thorley said. His voice was calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I have lived alone in these woods for 15 years. I know every rock and every tree. And I am not afraid of cowards who attack women in the night." Valora felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in a long time. Hope. She crushed it down quickly. Hope was dangerous. Hope had led her to believe her neighbors were good people. Hope had convinced her that truth would triumph over fear. Hope had gotten her husband killed. "Tell me about him," Thorley said suddenly. Valora looked up. "What?" "Your husband. Tell me about him." She did not want to. Speaking about Samuel felt like ripping open a wound that had barely begun to heal. But something in Thorley's expression made her start talking anyway. She told him how she and Samuel met at a harvest festival when they were both 17. How he had asked her to dance 3 times before she finally said yes. How he had proposed under an apple tree in the middle of a rainstorm, getting down on one knee in the mud and laughing when she said yes before he could finish the question. She told him about their wedding, about their small farm, about the babies they lost and the grief they carried together, about Samuel's endless patience and his stubborn belief that people were basically good. "He thought I could help them," Valora said, her voice cracking. "Even when they turned against us, even when they beat him in the street, he told me to have faith. He said they would realize their mistake." Thorley was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled and popped between them. "He sounds like a good man," Thorley finally said. He was the best man I ever knew, Valora replied, and they killed him for loving me. No, Thorley said firmly. They killed him for their own fear. That is not the same thing. He leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes intense. Honor his belief, Thorley said. Honor it by living, by proving them wrong, by surviving when they wanted you dead. Valora stared at him. The words hit her like a physical blow. For weeks she had been waiting to die, planning for it, almost welcoming it. But now, sitting in this warm cabin with this strange man who had saved her life, she felt something else entirely. She felt angry. Not the cold, numb anger she had carried since fleeing Belwick. This was hot and sharp and alive. This was the anger of someone who refused to be a victim anymore. Before she could respond, a sudden pounding shook the cabin door. Both of them froze. "Blackwood!" a man's voice shouted from outside. "Open up! We know the witch is here." Thorley's expression hardened to stone. He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed his shotgun from the corner. "Get into the cellar," he said quietly, pointing to a trap door hidden beneath a rug in the corner. "Now, do not make a sound." Valora scrambled to obey. Her legs were still weak, but fear gave her strength. She lifted the trap door and lowered herself into the darkness below. The last thing she saw before the door closed above her was Thorley checking his shotgun and walking toward the front door. She pressed herself against the cold dirt wall of the cellar. Jars of preserved food lined shelves on either side of her. The smell of earth and stored vegetables filled her nose. Above her she heard the cabin door open. "There is no witch here," Thorley's voice said calmly. "Just me and my dinner." "We followed her tracks," another voice argued. "We know she came this way." "Then you followed wrong," Thorley replied. "Only tracks out there are mine." Boots shuffled on the wooden floor above. Multiple men from the sound of it. "At least 4 or 5. We have the right to search." The voice belonged to someone used to giving orders, Silas Pruitt, head of the Belwick Town Council, the man who had organized the mob that destroyed her life. "You are on my land," Thorley answered. His voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "Leave." Valora heard the distinctive click of a shotgun being raised and cocked. Silence stretched for an eternity. She clutched her grandmother's pendant and prayed to anyone who might be listening. "We will be back," Silas finally snarled, "with the sheriff and a search warrant." "Bring whoever you want," Thorley replied. "Now get off my property before I decide this conversation has gone on long enough." Footsteps retreated. The cabin door slammed shut. Valora waited in the darkness, barely breathing, until the trapdoor opened above her. Thorley's face appeared, lit from behind by firelight. "They are gone," he said. "For now." He reached down and helped her climb out of the cellar. Her legs nearly gave out, but he steadied her with one strong hand on her arm. "They will come back," she whispered. "Yes," Thorley agreed, "but not tonight. I should leave." Valora tried to stand straight. "I have put you in danger just by being here." Thorley blocked her path to the door. "And go where?" he asked. "Back to the barn? You will not survive the night. The temperature is dropping fast." "Then what do we do?" Thorley was quiet for a moment, thinking. The firelight flickered across his weathered face. "We leave," he said finally. "At first light. I know places they will never search, people who will not turn you away." "We?" Valora repeated. Thorley met her eyes. "You will not make it alone." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both survivors, both refugees from a world that had rejected them. And somehow, impossibly, they were in this together now. "Sleep," Thorley said. "I will keep watch." For the first time in 32 days, Valora Finch slept without nightmares. Dawn came gray and cold. Thorley woke Valora with a gentle hand on her shoulder and a cup of hot tea pressed into her palm. "We need to move," he said, "before the sun gets too high." Valora pushed herself upright from the pile of blankets Thorley had arranged for her near the fire. Her body ached in places she had forgotten existed, but she felt stronger than yesterday. The food and warmth had done their work. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North," Thorley replied. He was already moving around the cabin, shoving supplies into a leather pack. Food, blankets, a hunting knife, rope. "That is not an answer," Valora said. Thorley paused and looked at her. His expression was unreadable. "My mother's people," he said finally. "The Abnaki. My grandmother still lives with them. They have a winter camp in the mountains, hidden from outsiders." Valora felt her eyebrows rise in surprise. She had heard of the Abnaki, native people who had lived in these lands long before settlers arrived. Most folks in Belwick spoke of them with suspicion or open hostility. "Will they accept me?" she asked carefully. Thorley went back to packing. "If my grandmother accepts you, they all will. And if she does not, then we figure something else out," Thorley said. "But we are not staying here. Silas Pwitt is a coward, but he is not stupid. He will return with enough men to burn this cabin to the ground." Valora dressed quickly in the warmest clothes Thorley could spare. An old coat that hung past her knees, thick wool socks, a hat made of rabbit fur that smelled like smoke and pine. She looked ridiculous, drowning in fabric meant for a man twice her size. Thorley did not laugh. He simply nodded once and handed her a walking stick. "Keep close," he said. "Step where I step. These woods have dangers you do not know." They left as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Thorley led the way into the forest, moving with a confidence that spoke of years spent in this wilderness. He knew every fallen log, every hidden ravine, every path that would support their weight, and every patch of ground that would swallow them whole. Valora struggled to keep pace. Her legs were still weak from weeks of starvation. The snow pulled at her boots with every step, trying to drag her down, but she refused to complain. She refused to slow them down more than necessary. They traveled for hours without speaking. The forest grew thicker around them, ancient pines blocking out the sky. Occasionally Thorley would stop and listen, his head tilted like a wolf sensing prey. Then he would change direction slightly, leading them along routes that seemed random, but always took them farther from any chance of pursuit. Around midday, they stopped to rest beside a frozen stream. Thorley pulled dried meat and hard biscuits from his pack and shared them with Valora. "You are doing well," he said. "Better than I expected." "I am stronger than I look," Valora replied, though her body screamed at her that this was a lie. Thorley almost smiled. Almost. They continued on through the afternoon. The terrain grew steeper, the path less clear. Valora fell twice, catching herself on tree branches before she could tumble down the rocky slopes. Both times, Thorley was there instantly, pulling her back to her feet without comment. As the sun began setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thorley stopped suddenly. He held up one hand for silence. Valora froze. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Someone is following us," Thorley said quietly. He did not turn around. His eyes scanned the trees ahead, but his focus was clearly behind them. "Silas?" Valora whispered. "No," Thorley replied. "Someone else. Wait here." Before she could protest, he melted into the forest like a shadow. One moment he was standing beside her. The next, he had vanished completely. Valora pressed her back against a massive pine tree and tried to control her breathing. The forest had gone silent around her. No bird calls, no wind through the branches, just the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Then Thorley emerged from the trees, not alone. He walked beside a young man dressed in deerskin and furs, his long black hair braided down his back. Behind them came two more figures, older men with hard faces and bows slung across their shoulders. "Hunters," Thorley explained. "From my grandmother's people. They have been watching this territory for strangers." Valora did not know what to say. The hunters studied her with dark, unreadable eyes. She felt naked under their gaze, all her weaknesses exposed. Thorley spoke to them in a language Valora did not recognize. The words flowed smooth and musical, nothing like English. The hunters listened, occasionally asking questions that Thorley answered without hesitation. Finally, the oldest hunter nodded once. He said something that made Thorley's shoulders relax slightly. "They will take us to the camp," Thorley translated. "The elders will decide what happens next." "And if the elders say no?" Valora asked. Thorley looked at her with something close to warmth. "Then I will argue until they change their minds." They traveled the rest of the way in silence, the hunters leading them through paths that seemed invisible until you were already on them. Night fell completely, but the moon rose bright and full, turning the snow to silver. The Abnaki winter camp appeared suddenly, as if conjured from nothing. One moment they were walking through empty forest. The next, Valora saw fires glowing inside bark-covered lodges, heard voices speaking that same musical language, smelled smoke and cooking meat. Dozens of eyes watched them enter the camp, women holding children, old men sitting near fires, young warriors with the same hard expressions as the hunters who had found them. Valora expected hostility. What she saw instead was something else entirely: curiosity, caution, and underneath it all, a kind of quiet dignity she had never encountered in Belwick. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger lodges. Her hair was silver and braided. Her back was straight despite her obvious age. Her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. She walked directly to Thorley and touched his face with both hands. Whatever she said made the hard lumberjack actually smile. "Grandmother," he replied in English, clearly for Valora's benefit. The old woman turned to study Valora. Her gaze missed nothing: the borrowed clothes, the hollow cheeks, the desperation barely hidden beneath exhaustion. She spoke in her own language, and Thorley listened carefully before translating. "She asks what burden you carry." Valora swallowed hard. She looked at this ancient woman, this stranger from a world she did not understand, and spoke the truth. "Tell her I was called a witch because I tried to heal. Tell her I lost my home, my husband, and nearly my life because of fear," Thorley translated. The grandmother listened without expression. Then she laughed. It was not cruel laughter. It was warm and knowing, the laughter of someone who had seen too much of human foolishness to be surprised by any of it. She spoke again, and Thorley smiled faintly. "She says only foolish people fear healers. She says you may stay." Relief hit Valora like a wave. Her legs buckled, and suddenly Thorley was beside her, one strong arm around her waist holding her upright. "She also says you are too thin," Thorley added, "and that I should have fed you better." The grandmother barked orders to the people around her. Within minutes, Valora found herself seated inside a warm lodge wrapped in soft furs, with a bowl of thick stew being pressed into her hands. She ate until she could not eat any more. Then she slept, surrounded by strangers who did not fear her, in a place where no one called her a witch. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt safe. 2 days passed in the Abnaki camp. 2 days of rest and food and slowly returning strength. The people treated Valora with quiet kindness, offering her extra blankets and portions of their own meals. The children were curious about her pale skin and strange accent, following her around the camp like small shadows until their mothers called them away. Thorley stayed close, but not too close. He spent his days helping the hunters repair snares and sharpen tools. He seemed different here, Valora noticed, less guarded, more at ease, like a man finally breathing after being underwater for years. On the morning of the 3rd day, that peace shattered. Thorley returned from an early morning hunt with a face like thunderclouds. He found Valora helping the women prepare deer hide and pulled her aside with urgent words. "Men from Belwick are gathering," he said quietly. "A trader spotted them on the southern road. They are blaming you for sickness in their livestock now." Valora felt her blood run cold. How far away? 2 days' march. Maybe less if they push hard. She looked around the camp. at the families going about their morning routines, at the children playing in the snow. These people have already risked too much for me, she said. I will not bring violence to their homes. Thorley shook his head. Running will not help. They will follow. They will keep following until they find you or die trying. Men like Silas do not give up when their pride is wounded. Then what do I do? The question hung in the air between them. Valora had asked it 1,000 times in her mind over the past weeks. Every answer led to the same place: more running, more hiding, more waiting for the inevitable moment when they caught up to her. But something had changed inside her since arriving at this camp. The food had restored her body, the rest had cleared her mind, and the anger that had sparked in Thorley's cabin had grown into something stronger. She was tired of being prey. I need to face them, Valora said slowly. The words surprised her even as they left her mouth. Not to save myself, to stop them. Thorley stared at her. They will not listen to reason. You saw how they were in Belwick. They will listen if children are at risk, Valora replied. Her mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. The sickness in the livestock, the children who died last winter, the timing of it all. I know what made them sick, she continued. It was not witchcraft. It was the water. The mining company upstream from Belwick started operations last spring. I saw the signs in the creek even before the first child fell ill. Discoloration, dead fish, that metallic smell. Thorley's eyes narrowed. Mercury. Yes, Valora said. Mercury poisoning. It explains everything. The livestock dying first because they drink more water, then the weakest humans, the children, the elderly. Why did you not tell them this before? I tried, Valora said bitterly, but by then they had already decided I was guilty. No one wanted to hear about contaminated water when they could blame a witch instead. Thorley was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had said. If you can prove it, he finally said. If you can make them understand. You will not be able to do it from hiding. I know, Valora replied. That is why I need to go back. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. But Valora knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that this was the only way forward. Running had not saved Samuel. Running had not saved her. The only thing that could save her now was the truth. Thorley placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. I will be with you, he said. Whatever happens. Valora felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away. Why? She asked. You barely know me. You owe me nothing. Thorley looked at her with an expression she could not read. Because some things are worth fighting for, he said, and because I am tired of watching good people suffer while cowards sleep safely in their beds. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Thorley gathered supplies and weapons. Valora sat with the grandmother, learning what she could about the medicinal properties of the plants the Abnaki used. Different from what she knew, but effective, powerful. The grandmother gave her a small pouch filled with herbs before they left. For the children, Thorley translated, she says they will need a healer when this is over. She says you will need to be ready. Valora clutched the pouch like a lifeline. On the morning they departed, the whole camp gathered to see them off. The hunters who had found them in the forest, the women who had fed her, the children who had followed her around like curious puppies. The grandmother approached Valora last. She placed both hands on Valora's cheeks, just as she had done with Thorley, and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of 100 years. She says fear is a fire, Thorley translated. It burns bright, but it burns out quickly. Courage is water. It flows around obstacles. It finds a way. Valora bowed her head in respect. Thank you, she said, for everything. The grandmother smiled. Then she turned and walked back toward her lodge without another word. Thorley led the way into the forest. Behind them, the Abnaki camp disappeared into the trees as if it had never existed at all. They moved fast, no longer trying to hide their trail. If the men from Belwick wanted to find them, Valora was going to make it easy. On the second day of travel, they heard voices ahead. Not just voices. Shouting, torches, the crack of boots through frozen underbrush. They found us, Thorley said grimly. He unslung his shotgun and checked the load. "Good," Valora replied. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. "Let them come. I have something to say." The mob emerged from the forest like a nightmare made flesh. 30 men at least, carrying torches and ropes and the righteous fury of people who believe they are doing God's work. At their head walked Silas Pwitt, his face twisted with hatred and triumph. Thorley stepped forward, shotgun raised. His finger rested on the trigger, ready to fire. "That is close enough," he said. His voice carried across the clearing like a blade. Silas laughed. "1 man against 30. You always were a fool, Blackwood." "Maybe," Thorley replied. "But I am a fool with a gun and nothing to lose. How many of you want to die before you reach her?" The mob hesitated. Some men in the back exchanged uncertain glances. Dying for a cause was different from watching someone else die for it. Valora stepped out from behind Thorley before he could stop her. She walked forward until she stood directly in front of the mob, close enough to see the firelight reflected in Silas Pwitt's eyes. "I will speak," she said loudly. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. Silas sneered. "The witch wants to beg for her life. How touching." "I am not going to beg," Valora replied. "I am going to tell you the truth. Whether you listen is your choice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men looked curious despite themselves. Others gripped their torches tighter, waiting for the order to attack. "You have cursed our town," Silas shouted. "Our livestock are dying, our children are sick, and it is all because of you." "No," Valora said firmly. "Your livestock are dying because the water is poisoned. Your children are sick because you have been drinking mercury for months." The word cut through the air like a knife. Mercury. Every person there knew what it meant, knew its dangers. "She is lying," Silas screamed. "She is trying to confuse us." "Test the water," Valora said. Her voice carried over his. "Collect a sample from the creek that runs through town. Take it to a doctor in the city. He will tell you what I already know." "And what is that?" Pastor Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his face pale and pinched. "What do you claim to know, witch?" "I know that the mining company upstream has been dumping their waste into the water supply," Valora said. "I know that mercury poisoning affects animals before it affects humans. I know that the children who died last winter all lived closest to the creek." She took another step forward. Several men in the front row stepped back instinctively. "I also know," she continued, "that when I tried to tell you this before, you beat my husband and drove us into the wilderness to die. You were so eager to blame someone that you never bothered to look for the real cause." Silence fell over the clearing. The torches crackled. The wind whispered through the pines. "Dr. Morrison," Valora called out. She had spotted him near the back of the mob, his medical bag clutched to his chest. "You examined the children before they died. Tell me, did their symptoms match what you would expect from mercury poisoning?" All eyes turned to the doctor. He was a small man, nervous by nature, more comfortable with books than confrontation. But he was also honest, perhaps too honest for his own good. He stammered. "The symptoms did. The tremors, the skin discoloration, the manner of—" He could not finish. But he did not need to. "She is lying," Silas roared. He drew a knife from his belt and lunged toward Valora. What happened next would be talked about in Belwick for generations. A half-starved dog burst from the trees and threw itself at Silas with savage fury. Valora recognized it instantly, a hound she had nursed back to health 2 summers ago when its owner had left it for dead with a broken leg. It clamped its jaws around Silas's leg and refused to let go no matter how hard he kicked and screamed. Chaos erupted. Men shouted. Torches dropped into the snow and sizzled out. In the confusion, someone tackled Silas and pinned him to the ground while others pulled the dog away. When order finally returned, Silas lay bleeding in the snow, his eyes wild with pain and rage. "Enough!" Pastor Whitmore shouted. His voice broke through the madness like a bell cutting through fog. "Enough! We will test the water. We will verify her claims. If she is right." He trailed off, unwilling to say what everyone was thinking. "If she is right," Dr. Morrison finished quietly, "then we have made a terrible mistake." Valora looked at the faces around her, at men who had wanted her dead minutes ago, now staring at her with something that might have been the beginning of doubt. "I am going back to Belwick," she said, "not as your enemy, as your healer. There are sick children who need help, and I will not abandon them even if their parents wanted me dead." She turned and walked toward Thorley, her back exposed to 30 men with weapons. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. No one tried to stop her. Thorley's cabin became a place of healing. Within hours of the confrontation in the forest, mothers began arriving with sick children in their arms, pale faces, trembling hands, eyes bright with fever and fear. They came reluctantly at first, their pride warring with their desperation. Valora welcomed each one without judgment. She worked through the first night without rest, brewing teas from the herbs the grandmother had given her, mixing poultices from plants she gathered in the frozen forest, cooling fevers with damp cloths, soothing frightened children with gentle words. Thorley stayed by her side through all of it. He lifted children who were too weak to move themselves. He fetched clean water from the spring, not the contaminated creek. He stood guard at the door whenever voices grew too loud outside. By dawn, 6 children lay sleeping peacefully in the cabin. Their fevers had broken. Their tremors had eased. For the first time in weeks, their parents dared to hope. "How did you know?" one mother asked, tears streaming down her face. She held her young son close, her hands still shaking from fear. "How did you know it was the water?" "Because I paid attention," Valora said gently. "Because I looked at what was actually happening, instead of looking for someone to blame." The mother lowered her eyes in shame. "We treated you so badly." "Yes," Valora agreed. "You did." But then she reached out and touched the woman's hand. "And I am still here," Valora continued, "because being right matters less than helping people who need it, even people who have hurt me." More mothers arrived throughout the day. More children. Some adults, too. Older folks who had been drinking from the creek longer than anyone. Valora treated them all. Dr. Morrison came in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Valora work with an expression of profound embarrassment. "I should have listened to you," he said quietly. "When you first came to me with your concerns about the water, I should have investigated." "Yes," Valora said without looking up from the child she was treating. "You should have." "I was afraid," the doctor admitted. "Afraid of what Silas would do if I contradicted him. Afraid of being the next person accused of witchcraft." Valora finally met his eyes. "Fear makes cowards of us all. But you are here now. That counts for something." She handed him a list of herbs and instructions written in her careful handwriting. "These treatments will help manage the symptoms," she said. "But the only real cure is clean water. The town needs to stop drinking from the creek immediately. Use the spring on the eastern hill instead, and someone needs to make that mining company answer for what they have done." Dr. Morrison took the list with trembling hands. "I will handle it," he said. "I will ride to the city myself. I will bring back proof that cannot be denied." "Good," Valora said. "Then go. These people have suffered long enough." The doctor left. More patients arrived, and Valora kept working. As night fell again, Thorley finally convinced her to rest. "You cannot help anyone if you collapse," he said. His voice was gentle but firm. He practically forced her to sit down in the chair by the fire and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "When did you last sleep?" he asked. Valora tried to remember. She could not. "That is what I thought," Thorley said. He pressed a cup of warm tea into her hands. "Sleep. I will watch over them." "You have barely slept either," Valora pointed out. "I have slept enough," Thorley replied, "and I am not the one they need." "You are," Valora wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her, exhaustion pulling her down into the chair like an anchor dragging her to the ocean floor. "Thank you," she murmured. Her eyes were already closing. "For everything. I do not know why fate sent you to that barn, but—" She trailed off, sleep claiming her before she could finish the thought. Thorley sat down across from her and watched her sleep. Her face, still too thin, had lost some of its haunted quality. Her breathing was deep and even. She was the strongest person he had ever met. He did not know what to do with that realization. 3 days after the confrontation in the forest, riders returned from the city. Dr. Morrison led them, accompanied by 2 official-looking men in expensive coats, and a woman who carried herself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Behind them came a wagon loaded with medical supplies. The whole town gathered in the square to hear their report. Valora stood at the edge of the crowd, Thorley beside her. People who had wanted her dead a week ago now gave her respectful nods as they passed. "The test results are clear," Dr. Morrison announced. His voice shook with emotion. "The creek water contains dangerous levels of mercury. The mining company has been dumping waste into the river upstream for over a year." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people began crying. Others simply stood in stunned silence. The woman in the expensive coat stepped forward. She introduced herself as a government inspector sent to investigate the mining company's practices. "Based on our findings," she said, "the company will be shut down immediately. The owners will face criminal charges, and compensation will be arranged for the families affected." More crying. More shock. But underneath it all, Valora could see something else emerging. Shame. Deep, painful shame. Pastor Whitmore pushed through the crowd until he stood in front of Valora. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. "Mrs. Finch," he said. His voice cracked. "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. I pointed the finger at you. I called you." He could not even say the word. "I was wrong. Terribly, unforgivably wrong." "Yes," Valora said quietly. "You were." She let the words hang in the air for a moment, let him feel their weight. "But I did not come back here for apologies," she continued. "I came back because children were dying, and I could help. That is what healers do." Pastor Whitmore bowed his head. "What can we do to make amends?" Valora looked around at the crowd, at the faces she had known her whole life. Some looked at her with gratitude. Others could not meet her eyes at all. "You cannot bring back my husband," she said. Her voice remained steady, but the words cost her more than anyone would ever know. "You cannot undo what you did to us. You cannot give me back the life I lost." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But you can learn from this," she continued. "You can teach your children to question their fears instead of surrendering to them. You can remember that accusations are not the same as truth, and that mobs do not deliver justice." Her eyes found Silas Preet in the crowd. He stood apart from the others, his legs still bandaged from the dog bite, his face twisted with barely suppressed rage. "And you can remove the man who took bribes from the mining company to keep quiet about the poison," Valora said. Her voice rose so everyone could hear. "The man who knew your children were dying and did nothing because his pockets were full." All eyes turned to Silas. The silence that followed was terrible. "That is a lie," Silas screamed. "She is still trying to destroy us." "She is." "Prove it," Valora said calmly. "Open your accounts to inspection. Let the government officials see where your money came from this past year. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear." Silas's face went white. His eyes darted around the crowd looking for allies. He found none. "You would take the word of a witch over mine?" he demanded. "She is not a witch," Pastor Whitmore said quietly. His voice carried surprising strength. "She is a healer, and she just saved more lives in 3 days than any of us have saved in our entire time in this town." Silas ran. He made it maybe 20 feet before the young men of the town caught him and dragged him back. They were not gentle about it. The government inspector nodded to her assistants. They pulled documents from their satchels. "We already have evidence," the inspector said. "Bank records showing substantial payments from the mining company to Mr. Pwitt over the past 18 months. Enough to send him to prison for a very long time." As they led Silas away, Valora felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just exhaustion. The monster who had destroyed her life was being led away in chains. The truth had finally won. But Samuel was still dead, and nothing could change that. Thorley's hand found hers in the crowd. His grip was warm and strong. "It is over," he said quietly. Valora shook her head. "No, this part is over. But what comes next?" She trailed off, not sure how to finish. "What comes next," Thorley said, "is whatever you choose. For the first time in a long time, you get to decide." The town council offered Valora everything. A house in the center of town, an official position as the community healer, a formal apology read aloud in the church where she had been condemned, money enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. She refused it all. "I am not coming back," she told them at the final town meeting. Her voice was calm but firm. "Not to live. You asked me to trust you once, and I did. You used that trust to destroy everything I loved." Pastor Whitmore spread his hands pleadingly. "We were wrong. We know that now. We are trying to make amends." "And I appreciate that," Valora said, "truly. But some wounds do not heal by pretending they never happened. I will continue helping anyone who comes to me for healing, but I will do it on my own terms, in my own place." "Where will you go?" someone asked from the crowd. Valora glanced at Thorley, standing solid and silent near the door. "North," she said, "near the mountains, close enough to reach, far enough to breathe." "And what about Blackwood?" another voice called out. There was an edge of suspicion in the question, a lingering prejudice that had not quite died. "Mr. Blackwood saved my life," Valora replied evenly, "several times over. What happens between us is no one's business but our own." She walked out of the meeting hall without waiting for a response. Thorley fell into step beside her. They walked in companionable silence through the town, past the houses where she had delivered babies, past the farms where she had treated livestock, past the church where her husband had been beaten. At the edge of town, she stopped. "I need to say goodbye," she said. "To Samuel." Thorley nodded. "I will wait." Valora walked alone to the abandoned barn. The snow had melted some since she was last here, revealing patches of brown earth and dead grass. The wooden cross she had carved still stood at the head of Samuel's grave, tilted slightly by the wind. She knelt beside it, heedless of the cold mud soaking through her dress. "They know the truth now," she said quietly. "The people who hurt us. They know they were wrong. Silas will spend the rest of his life in prison. The mining company has been shut down. Children are getting better instead of worse." She placed her hand on the frozen earth. "I wish you could see it," she continued. "You always believed the truth would win. You always believed people would choose good over fear if given the chance." Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. "You were right," she whispered. "In the end, you were right." She stayed there for a long time, talking to her husband about everything that had happened, about Thorley, about the Abnaki, about the strange journey that had brought her from death's door to this moment. When she finally stood, the sun was setting. Thorley waited where she had left him, patient as a mountain. "Are you ready?" he asked. Valora wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." They traveled north together as winter finally began loosening its grip on the land. Spring was coming. Valora could smell it in the air, that promise of new growth hiding just beneath the frozen surface. Thorley built a healing house beside his cabin. He worked from dawn to dusk for weeks, cutting timber, raising walls, fitting windows so that light could pour in for patients who needed it. Valora gathered herbs. She made medicines. She prepared for the people who would come, and they did come. At first, just a trickle. Travelers who had heard rumors of a healer in the northern woods, families from distant towns whose doctors had given up on them. Desperate people willing to try anything. Valora welcomed them all. Word spread. The trickle became a stream. The healing house grew busy with patients, some staying for days or weeks while their bodies recovered. Not everyone was grateful. Some whispered old accusations behind her back. Some crossed themselves when they saw her, still afraid of what they did not understand. Valora learned to ignore them. She had faced a mob that wanted to burn her alive. A few whispered insults meant nothing. As months passed, something else changed too. Something between her and Thorley. It started small. Shared meals that lasted longer than necessary. Conversations by firelight that stretched into the early hours. Glances held a moment too long. Neither of them spoke of it directly. Neither of them needed to. One spring evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Thorley found Valora sitting on a log outside the healing house. She was watching the first flowers of the season push through the melting snow. "When I found you in that barn," Thorley said quietly, "you were dying." Valora nodded. "I remember. Look at you now." She turned to face him. The sunset light caught his features, softening the hard edges of his weathered face. "I lived because you stood between me and the cold," she said. Thorley shook his head slowly. "No. You lived because you chose to. I just gave you a chance." He sat down beside her on the log, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I have lived alone for 15 years, he said. "After what happened to my mother. After my father. I thought alone was safer. I thought alone was the only way to survive." "And now?" Valora asked. "Now I think I was just afraid," Thorley admitted. "Afraid of losing someone else. Afraid of caring and having it ripped away." Valora reached out and took his hand. His fingers curled around hers, rough and warm. "I have lost everything twice now," she said. "My family when I was young, my husband when I was grown. Part of me believes I should run from anything that might hurt me again." "But," Thorley prompted. "But you taught me something," Valora continued. "When you carried me out of that barn, when you stood against the mob, when you built this house with your own hands. What did I teach you?" "That surviving is not the same as living," Valora said. "And that being alone is not the same as being safe." Thorley was silent for a long moment. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I am not good with words," he said. "I know," Valora replied. "Neither am I." They sat together watching the sunset, their hands intertwined, saying everything that needed to be said without speaking a single word. They married on a perfect spring morning, beneath an open sky filled with birdsong. The guests were few but meaningful. The grandmother and several members of her tribe traveled from their camp in the mountains. Dr. Morrison came from Belwick, his wife beside him, both of them carrying gifts and apologies that Valora accepted with grace. A few families from town made the journey as well. Mothers whose children Valora had saved. Fathers who had finally learned to see past their fear. They stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, uncertain of their welcome, staying anyway because some debts must be acknowledged even when they cannot be repaid. Pastor Whitmore did not come. Valora had not invited him. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. The grandmother performed the ceremony, speaking blessings in her own language, while Thorley translated for the guests who did not understand. Her words were simple but powerful, talking about the joining of two rivers, about strength found in unity, about love that grows from shared suffering. When she finished, Thorley took both of Valora's hands in his. "I do not have pretty words," he said. "You know that about me." Valora smiled. "I know. But I have this," Thorley continued. "I have hands that will build whatever you need. I have arms that will protect you from any threat. I have a heart that chose you the moment I saw you fighting to survive when any other person would have given up." He squeezed her hands gently. "I cannot promise you an easy life," he said. I cannot promise you wealth or comfort or any of the things other men might offer, but I can promise you this. You will never face darkness alone again, not as long as I breathe." Valora felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "Samuel taught me that love is patient," she said softly. "He taught me that love is kind. When I lost him, I thought I would never feel that kind of love again. I thought that part of me died with him in the snow." She looked into Thorley's eyes, those dark depths that had seen so much pain and chosen gentleness anyway. "You taught me something different," she continued. "You taught me that love can be fierce, that it can fight, that it can stand against the world and refuse to break. I never expected to find someone who understood my scars because he carries his own." She lifted their joined hands and pressed them against her heart. "I do not need pretty words either," she said. "I just need you, standing beside me, for however many years we have left." The grandmother spoke the final blessing. The guests cheered, and Thorley Blackwood kissed Valora Finch for the first time since they met, sealing promises that both of them intended to keep forever. The celebration lasted until sunset. Food was shared. Stories were told. The grandmother taught some of the Belwick children a game involving stones and sticks, laughing at their attempts to master it. As darkness fell, the guests began their journeys home. The grandmother embraced Valora one last time, speaking words that Thorley translated with emotion in his voice. "She says you have proven yourself," he said. "Not by your healing, not by your courage, but by your heart. She says you are family now. Her family, always." Valora bowed her head, too moved to speak. When everyone had gone, she and Thorley stood together outside their home, the healing house on one side, the cabin on the other, the forest stretching endlessly around them, full of danger and beauty in equal measure. "Mrs. Blackwood," Thorley said, testing the name. Valora smiled. "It will take some getting used to. We have time," Thorley replied. And they did. Years passed like water over stones, smoothing rough edges, wearing paths through hard surfaces. The healing house grew. Thorley added rooms when they were needed. A nursery for babies born to mothers who could not make it home in time. A recovery ward for patients who needed weeks instead of days. A teaching space where Valora passed her knowledge to young women who wanted to learn. She never charged for her services. Those who could pay gave what they could spare. Those who could not paid nothing at all. Some left food or blankets or handmade gifts. Some left only their gratitude. It was enough. Children came to live with them eventually, not born from her body but chosen by her heart. Orphans from the towns, native children whose parents had died. Little ones abandoned by families who could not care for them. Valora and Thorley raised them all, teaching them to heal and hunt and survive. The town of Belwick rebuilt itself. New leaders emerged. The mining company never returned. The water ran clean again. But memories lingered. Every year on the anniversary of her exile, families placed flowers at the edge of town where Valora and Samuel had fled into the wilderness. They called it Remembrance Day. A reminder to future generations of what fear could do when good people let it rule them. Valora visited Samuel's grave each spring when the first flowers bloomed. She told him about her life, about Thorley, about the children, about the hundreds of people she had healed since that terrible winter night. "You would be proud," she told him. "Not of me, of all of them, of what they became when they stopped being afraid." The grandmother passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn morning, surrounded by her people, her last words a blessing for the family she had chosen. Thorley built a memorial for her beside the healing house, a stone marker carved with symbols from her language, telling the story of a woman who welcomed strangers when others turned them away. As decades turned to dust, Valora's hair went gray and then white. Her hands grew spotted with age. Her steps slowed, but her eyes remained sharp, and her heart remained strong. She healed until she could no longer stand. Then she taught. Then she simply loved. On her last night, with Thorley beside her and their children gathered close, Valora Blackwood smiled at the life she had built from ashes. "They wanted me to die," she whispered. "Do you remember?" Thorley held her hand, his own skin weathered by time, his grip still warm. "I remember," he said. "I did not die," Valora said. "I became something stronger." She closed her eyes. Stronger than fear. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.